Our reading this week is in Joshua chapter 4. If you want to get your Bible and head over there, and we'll talk a little bit about the reading today. If you want some interesting behind-the-scenes data on the podcast, this is going to be the second time Jeff and I have recorded this podcast because we actually did the whole thing without realizing the machine was recording. So
was not recording.
Yeah, it was not. Didn't I say that?
Yeah. The first one was way better than this one already.
Yeah.
So,
we're just we're doing this exact same thing twice, and we'll let you be the judge how this comes out. Actually, we're finishing a story we started last podcast in Joshua chapter 3 with the Jordan crossing.
Yeah.
And this sort of is the actual going across of the water. But again, not a lot of emphasis given to the actual process of crossing as much as to the significance.
Yeah, the meaning is what matters.
Yeah, and what this event really says in a couple of ways. So we probably should start out by talking about the rocks. Because a big deal is made, and y'all may even have some confusion when you're reading this about what they're doing with the rocks when they cross over this time.
Yeah. Memorials matter, especially in the Old Testament. Significant events, markers thereof, and so forth. And so it seems to be probably one of the most likely understandings of what's going on here is, the first time you see this whole 12 stones. Verse 9, Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, a place where the feet of the priests, bearing the ark had stood, and they are there to this day. And so, but the whole point is those rocks where the miracle, happened is God's presence literally, drove the Jordan waters away. The problem is once the ark and God leave that spot, what happens to those stones that memorialize the place where it happened? They're underwater.
Right.
And so what you do then is you take, other stones, you set up 12 stones, of course, symbolizing the 12 tribes, and you set them up on the shore, kind of equivalent to, so because you can't see the actual ones of the spot where it actually happened, because that's the whole point of the miracle. It was underwater now. Right. You're not supposed to be there. You can't be there. And so these other stones bear, a mark to where you crossed over, where you came out. And so, kind of like a dual marker of where it actually happened versus the spot where we came out, where we can still stand. And just, the fact that there have to be two sets of stones underscores it was a miracle. It was an enormous miracle.
Yeah, that's not an uncommon thing. We do similar things in our culture. For example, we have in Washington, D.C., a memorial for World War II soldiers.
Right.
But, of course, no battles from World War II
were fought
on the continental U.S.
Right.
And but there are also all kinds of memorials over in Europe, from the actual hallowed ground where the battles were waged.
Right.
Like all kinds of D-Day memorials.
Yeah, Normandy, beaches of Normandy.
Yeah, right there on the beach where the battles were waged. So same kind of thing going on. And so as you do the reading this week, don't let that confuse you. You've got one memorial literally on the side, and then the other one I think is at Gilgal, where they were going to place the other stones. And it's interesting, 12 stones, and I don't want to make too much out of this, but 12 stones come up again. They come up again at the end of the story.
Well, 12 is always a significant number, right? I mean,
And the foundation stones of the city of God that's talked about in the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
And so
12 is just in the Bible, meant to be symbolically the number of the people of God. The number of the people of God is 12. That's why you have 24 elders in Revelation, because the idea is Old Covenant, New Covenant. Right. 12 tribes, 12 apostles. Yeah. So
actually
12,
13, but
yes. Well, and that's the birthright. That's the birthright concept, right? 12 plus 1 is how you get a birthright share, that extra share.
The other thing that I think is really important in chapter 4 is the significance of the event for Joshua, because there are obviously echoes here of the Great Sea, right?
Yeah. It's meant to be a parallel. Parallel.
And I think, Moses' first moment with the nation, so to speak, is the Red Sea. Not that there weren't other miracles, but that was the historic exit out of bondage, and now new leader and exit out of the wilderness into the promised land. It's sort of the bookend moment by two sea crossings.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Joshua is not Moses, but Joshua is meant to be a successor to Moses. He's not going to bring a covenant. Not quite, the same, but chapter 3, God made very clear to Joshua That basically I'm going to elevate you. Verse 7, I'm going to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they will know, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And then that's parallel here in chapter 4.
Says the same thing in verse 14.
Correct. That's exactly what happened. What God said He's going to do in chapter 3 is exactly what happened in chapter 4, where Joshua was exalted. And so just as they stood in awe of Moses, now they stand in awe of Joshua. They begin to realize that he is God's agent in our generation.
Yeah, it's God through the miracle putting His mark on the man.
Yeah.
This is my guy,
Yeah.
which is interesting because I think properly understood, that is sort of the primary purpose of the New Testament miracles. The apostles could perform miracles so that men would know that these are God's agents. These are God's men to deliver His revelation. And so it kind of gives you this general purpose of elders really down through time biblically.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Signs meant to say, and in fact, in one sense, to show that they are wielding the derivative authority of God that He has given them in their role. And so again, just like in the book of Numbers, when Moses' authority was challenged, bad things happened because God had validated him as my agent in this generation, my guy in this generation. So the same thing with Joshua here, just connecting the dots of the authority and mantle of Moses has passed to this man.
Yep. These ideas, these patterns, these themes that run through Scripture, we really ought to be more careful to take note of them.
God likes His patterns.
Yeah, that's exactly true. And then on the back end, in verse 24, after the Red Sea is crossed, we're told that this happens so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty. And then he adds, so that you may know, or rather, you may fear the Lord your God forever. And so I see two groups in 24. In the first segment of the verse, it seems to me he's talking to all the nations. And this is a demonstration of power, which, by the way, I think they get a sense of that. We know that Rahab's worried about them coming.
Well, we know what your God did to Egypt.
We know what your God has done. But then he also says, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. And that seems to me to be specifically focused on Israel. It's sort of like the same thing that David says when he goes up against Goliath, that everyone will know the greatness of God, but that this people may also know that it's the Lord's hand that gives you the victory.
Well, and that's the ironic and tragic, again, pattern all the way through, guys. I think about then you brought up David, you go all the way down to Jesus' day. Like with the Syrophoenician woman, where Jesus says of this woman's faith, I've not found this in Israel. That sometimes, ironically, pagan Gentiles are paying more and better attention and getting the implications of the mighty acts of God than God's own people, who literally have a covenant and a prophet or some other one among them who's explicitly saying, this is God doing this. And and yet and their stubbornness, hardness of heart, what have you. They're oblivious and weak of faith. And it's the pagans who are in fear and trembling at the revelation of God's power.
Yeah, there's going to be a really significant contrast as we begin with the river crossing between this generation and the generation that crossed the Red Sea.
Yeah.
Because they were faithless and refused to go up. They didn't trust God. This generation, by contrast, after passing through the water, are going to be faithful, and they're going to end up going up and conquering the whole land. And so it is the beginning of good things for this group, and a much different story than we encountered back in Numbers.
Right. That's exactly right.
So great segment to be reading with your kids. And continue to encourage you to do that. Particularly 3 and 4 here, the story of the crossing. And remember, we're reading that as a group, and so I encourage you to go back and read both chapters together and get that whole picture of the story firmly planted in your mind as we move forward from this point and watch them conquer the land.